For years, this case was spoken about as if it had reached its final chapter. A powerful attorney, a family known across South Carolina, a violent double murder that shocked the public and dominated headlines. And then, what many thought would never happen, a courtroom delivered its conclusion. Guilty. 2 life sentences. A sealed fate behind bars. A verdict that appeared to close the door on one of the most disturbing criminal trials in recent American memory. For a moment, silence followed the storm. Reporters moved on. The world assumed the story had ended, where justice had finally been served. But time has a way of unsettling even the most certain outcomes. Because years later, in a move few saw coming, a higher court stepped in. And what had been declared final was suddenly no longer stable. The conviction did not just come under review, it was wiped away. The trial that once seemed decisive was now under renewed scrutiny. Every testimony, every decision, every assumption that built the original outcome, questioned. And with that, the case that many believed was finished was pulled back into the center of attention. A new legal battle is now set in motion. Old evidence is being re-examined. And the question echoing across courtrooms and public debate is no longer what happened then, but how did everything unravel after the verdict was already delivered?
Before we uncover what led to this extraordinary legal reversal, there's something important to understand about this case, something that makes it different from most courtroom dramas. Because this wasn't just about a verdict being challenged. It was about whether the system itself had missed something critical the first time around. So pause for a moment and consider this. A case once declared complete is now being treated as if it was never truly settled. And that raises a disturbing possibility that the truth may not have been fully captured during the original trial. Before we step into the evidence, the testimonies, and the turning points that changed everything, subscribe to The Mind of the Killer and turn on notifications for more true crime documentaries. To understand why this retrial matters, we need to return to the moment everything began to fracture. June 2021, a date that, at first, carried no meaning beyond routine summer days in South Carolina, until it didn't. The Murdaugh name was not just known in the region, it was embedded in it. For generations, the family had been tied to the legal system, shaping courtrooms, influencing outcomes, and holding a kind of authority that stretched quietly through the Low Country. At the center of it all stood Alex Murdaugh, a respected attorney, a man who appeared to move comfortably within a legacy built long before him. But that image would not survive what came next. On the night of June 7th, 2021, emergency calls led authorities to a remote family property. What they discovered would immediately shift the tone of an entire investigation. Maggie Murdaugh, Paul Murdaugh, both found shot to death. A scene that did not just signal tragedy, it signaled confusion. Nothing about it was simple. Nothing about it explained itself. The shock moved fast through the community, and even faster through law enforcement. Investigators launched a full-scale homicide inquiry, piecing together timelines, movements, and digital evidence. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency became important. At first, attention moved in multiple directions. No clear suspect, no obvious motive, no clean narrative. But as the investigation deepened, something unexpected began to form in the background of the case. The focus slowly shifted, not outward, inward. And the person who once stood closest to the victims, the person expected to be helping solve the case, became the central figure of scrutiny. Alex Murdaugh. Not because it was the easiest answer, but because the evidence, piece by piece, began pointing back toward him in ways no one initially anticipated. And once that shift happened,
the entire case changed direction. The question was no longer just who did this.
It became whether the truth had been hiding in plain sight from the very beginning.
As investigators worked to reconstruct the final hours before the murders, the case grew more complicated with every answer they uncovered. The property itself became a puzzle. Who had been there that evening? Who had access to the land? And what exactly happened in the narrow window between the last known sightings of Maggie and Paul and the moment their lives were violently cut short? Detectives examined phone records, vehicle movements, witness statements, and digital evidence. Every minute was mapped. Every call was scrutinized. Every timeline was challenged. But the deeper investigators looked, the more questions surfaced. Why had Maggie and Paul been targeted? Was this an attack from an outside threat? Or was the truth much closer to home? As the investigation expanded, another story began to emerge, one that extended far beyond the crime scene. Behind the image of a successful attorney, prosecutors alleged that Alex Murdaugh was facing serious personal and financial turmoil. According to court proceedings, allegations of financial misconduct were beginning to close in.
Questions about missing money, client funds, and growing legal pressures were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Investigators and prosecutors would later argue that these pressures created a crisis unlike anything Alex had previously faced. The theory presented to jurors was dramatic. Prosecutors claimed the murders were carried out as a desperate attempt to divert attention away from mounting financial problems and the scrutiny surrounding them. It was a claim that would become one of the most fiercely debated aspects of the entire trial. Then came the piece of evidence that changed everything: a cell phone video. Short, ordinary, recorded near the family's dog kennels. At first glance, it appeared insignificant. But when investigators analyzed the recording, they believed they could hear voices in the background, including one voice they argued belonged to Alex Murdaugh. The significance was enormous. For months, Alex had maintained that he was not at the kennels shortly before the killings. Yet prosecutors argued that the video placed him there only minutes before Maggie and Paul's phones suddenly went silent. Inside the courtroom, the recording became a pivotal moment. Jurors listened carefully. Experts testified. Attorneys battled over its meaning. And for many watching the trial, the video became one of the strongest pieces of evidence connecting Alex to the timeline of the murders. But it was far from the only evidence presented. Over weeks of testimony, jurors heard from investigators, forensic specialists, friends, family members, and financial experts. The courtroom became a stage for competing narratives. One side argued that the evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward guilt. The other insisted that the investigation had overlooked alternative possibilities and rushed toward the wrong conclusion. The nation watched as every detail was dissected, every witness was analyzed, every inconsistency became a headline. Then, in March 2023, the trial reached its climax. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty. Guilty for the murder of Maggie Murdaugh. Guilty for the murder of Paul Murdaugh. The decision sent shockwaves across the country. For some, it was justice delivered. For others, it was a stunning fall from power. Soon afterward, Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. The courtroom drama appeared to be over. The verdict was in. The sentence had been imposed. And one of America's most closely watched murder cases seemed to have reached its final chapter. But while cameras moved on and headlines began to fade, a different battle was quietly taking shape behind courthouse walls. It wasn't about forensic evidence. It wasn't about the kennel video. And it wasn't about the murders themselves. Instead, it centered on something far more unexpected, a controversy involving the very process that had produced the guilty verdict. Whispers turned into allegations. Allegations turned into legal filings. And before long, questions were being raised about whether the jury, the foundation of the entire trial, had been influenced in ways no one knew at the time. If those claims were true, the consequences would be enormous. Because the issue was no longer whether Alex Murdaugh had been convicted. The issue was whether he had been convicted fairly. And that question would eventually reach the highest court in South Carolina,
setting the stage for a legal battle that could change the future of the case forever.
For months after the guilty verdict, the case appeared to be following a familiar path. Appeals were expected, legal arguments continued behind the scenes, and Alex Murdaugh remained in prison, serving his life sentences. But then, the focus of the story shifted in a direction almost no one anticipated. The controversy was no longer centered on the crime scene. It was no longer about ballistics evidence. It was no longer about cell phone records, timelines, or the kennel video that had played such a significant role during the trial. Instead, attention turned to the courtroom itself, the very place where the verdict had been decided. At the center of the growing dispute was Becky Hill, the clerk of court who had overseen many of the trial's administrative proceedings. What began as concerns raised by defense attorneys soon developed into allegations serious enough to attract national attention. According to the defense, Hill had engaged in conversations and conduct that crossed a line.
Is that Becky Hill was manipulating this jury to make sure that Alex Murdaugh was found guilty. Correct? Do you believe that?
Yes.
Do you believe that?
I do.
Do you believe that, Joe?
I know Becky Hill only through this trial. I like her personally. I don't know whether she had this grand scheme. We know now that she was writing a book. Maybe she saw a guilty verdict as more profitable than a not guilty. But whether she is genuinely the wizard behind the curtain in all of this, I don't think anyone knows that.
The integrity of the entire justice system depends on that principle. If outside influence reaches jurors, even unintentionally, it can raise questions about whether a defendant received a fair trial. And in a murder case carrying
Life sentences, those questions became impossible to ignore. As the allegations spread, legal observers across the country began asking the same question. Did anything happen that could have affected the jury's decision? Or were these simply desperate claims from a defense team attempting to overturn a conviction? The stakes could not have been higher, because proving actual innocence was not required to challenge the verdict. The defense only needed to demonstrate that the fairness of the trial itself had been compromised. That distinction would become crucial. Soon, sworn statements were collected, jurors were interviewed, court records were examined, and attorneys on both sides prepared for yet another courtroom battle, one focused not on the murders, but on the conduct surrounding the trial. The issue quickly moved through the appeals process and eventually landed before South Carolina's highest court. What followed was extraordinary. The legal system was now forced to examine itself. Judges were no longer reviewing evidence from the crime scene. Instead, they were evaluating whether the process that produced the guilty verdict could still be trusted. The question hanging over every hearing was simple, but its implications were enormous. If jurors had been improperly influenced, could the verdict stand? Or would one of the most famous murder convictions in recent American history be thrown into doubt? As arguments intensified, supporters of the conviction insisted that the evidence against Alex Murdaugh remained overwhelming. Others argued that fairness is not optional in the justice system. No matter how strong the evidence may appear, every defendant is entitled to an impartial jury and a trial free from improper influence. The debate divided legal experts, true crime followers, and even some people who had closely followed the original proceedings. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. South Carolina's highest court would finally decide whether the allegations surrounding the jury were serious enough to alter the future of the case. What that court concluded would send shockwaves through the legal world and reopen questions many believed had already been settled forever. At this point in the story, that question becomes unavoidable, because while the jury delivered a verdict that seemed decisive, the legal system doesn't only ask what was decided, it also asks how it was decided, and that's where the controversy begins to take shape. After the conviction, defense attorneys began challenging more than just the outcome. They began challenging the process itself. The argument was not simply that evidence was misread.
but that certain influences may have reached the jury in ways that should never have happened during a capital-level murder trial. At the center of the dispute were claims of improper external impact and concerns about whether all juror considerations remained strictly within the courtroom evidence presented. Even a trial that appears airtight can be destabilized if the integrity of the jury process is called into question, and that is exactly what started to happen here. Appeals were filed, hearings were requested, court documents were reviewed line by line, not for what was proven, but for whether the path to that conclusion was legally flawless. Because in the justice system, a guilty verdict is not only about certainty, it is about procedure. And when procedure is questioned at the highest level, even a finished case can be reopened. What followed was not a dramatic courtroom moment, but a slow legal unraveling behind closed doors, where judges don't revisit guilt or innocence first, they revisit fairness. And as those arguments advanced, the foundation of the original conviction began to face its most serious test yet, not in front of a jury this time, but in front of the appellate courts, deciding whether the trial itself had been compromised enough to justify starting over.
In May 2026, the South Carolina Supreme Court reached a decision that immediately sent shockwaves through the legal world. Unanimous. The murder convictions against Alex Murdaugh were overturned. But the language of the ruling was carefully precise, and that precision is what made it so significant. The court did not declare him innocent. It did not reevaluate the forensic evidence. It did not overturn the entire body of the prosecution's case. Instead, it focused on something more foundational: fairness. After reviewing the record, the justices concluded that improper external influence had reached the jury during deliberations, raising serious constitutional concerns about whether the trial had been conducted under fully impartial conditions. At the center of that finding was the conduct of former court clerk Becky Hill, whose actions were determined by the court to have crossed boundaries that should never be crossed in a trial of this magnitude. And in the justice system, even the strongest case can collapse if the process behind it is compromised. The ruling effectively reset the murder convictions. A new trial was ordered, not because the court answered the question of guilt differently, but because it determined the first answer may not have been reached under conditions the Constitution guarantees. The reaction was immediate. Legal experts debated it. Victims' advocates questioned it. The public struggled to reconcile how a case that once felt conclusively resolved had now been pulled back into uncertainty. And yet, there was another layer to the story that changed the emotional weight of the decision. Because despite the overturned convictions, Alex Murdaugh was not released. He remains behind bars. Separate financial crime convictions, unrelated to the murder charges, carry substantial prison sentences, ensuring that even as the murder case resets legally, his freedom remains restricted. So now the case exists in a strange legal space. A conviction erased, a retrial ordered, but no immediate release. And one question now hangs over everything that has happened so far. If the first trial is no longer valid in the eyes of the court, what will the next one reveal that the first one could not? Prosecutors have now confirmed their intention to move forward with a retrial, which means this case, once thought to be resolved in a courtroom verdict, will now be presented again from the beginning. A new jury will be selected, a new courtroom will hear the arguments, and every piece of evidence that once convinced 12 people beyond reasonable doubt will be examined all over again. The cell phone video from the dog kennels, the reconstructed timeline of movements on the night of the murders, the financial records that prosecutors say revealed a collapsing world of pressure and deception, and any new evidence either side believes could shift the balance once more. But this time, the case carries an additional weight it didn't have before.
It gets to the heart of the American justice system. I mean, the question isn't whether he's a good man or not. He's admitted that he's not. He's admitted that he's a liar, he's a thief, he's a fraudster. As Caroline pointed out, he's serving a 40-year sentence alone based off of stealing $12 million, 22 financial counts against him. But the bottom line is every defendant, even despicable or not, which this man is, deserves an impartial trial in America. I mean, we've seen this even from Alex Murdaugh, reportedly was surprised at the rights that were granted to him. And that's what makes America such a beautiful country. Unfortunately, this woman, Becky Hill, was serving her own financial interests because she was writing a book that she wanted to monetize, probably wanted to get famous, as you pointed out, and tainted the whole system. But we'll see a new trial, and it'll be based off of the evidence. And ultimately, that will be what we go by. But, it gets to the heart of the American justice system. Everyone deserves a fair trial.
A case that refuses to stay closed.
The overturning of Alex Murdaugh's conviction does not bring this story to an end. If anything, it sends it back to the beginning, only this time under an even harsher spotlight. Because now, the case exists in two realities at once. In one, a jury heard the evidence, weighed it carefully, and returned a guilty verdict on 2 counts of murder. A conclusion that, for many, felt final. In the other, the highest court in the state has ruled that the process leading to that verdict was not fully protected from outside influence, enough to compromise the constitutional standard required for a fair trial. And both of those realities now sit side by side, unresolved. Some legal analysts maintain that the original evidence remains powerful, consistent, and persuasive, that a retrial may ultimately lead to the same conclusion, regardless of procedural errors. Others point to something just as important, that no matter how strong a case appears, the justice system is built on the principle that outcomes must be reached the right way, not just the convincing way. And that is the tension this case now carries into its next chapter. A case that was once defined by its verdict is now defined by its uncertainty. The courtroom will reopen. Arguments will be rebuilt, and a new jury will once again be asked to answer a question that has already divided public opinion for years. But this time, they will do so without the influence of what came before. So now, the story turns outward, to you. Did the justice system correct a serious mistake in pursuit of fairness? Or has this case become something even more complex than a simple question of guilt and innocence? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to Mind of the Killer for more true crime investigations, courtroom mysteries, and criminal cases that refuse to stay closed.